Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted by Matthew Desmond. We are beginning, we are halfway through the final chapter of part one, and we are on the beginning of page 100. We have made it to the 100s. It's always an accomplishment for me when I'm reading a book. Okay, let's continue. Quote, Sharina, end quote, someone whispered. Sharina turned around and saw that Arlene had poked her head into room 400. Sharina stepped into the hallway and walked up to Arlene, who was tucking her face underneath the red hoodie. Quote, girl, end quote, Sharina said. Quote, I got to get you up out of this house or get my money. Genuine, because I got bills. I got a bill to show you right now that's going to take your eyes out your head, end quote. Sharina reached in her files and handed Arlene a tax bill for a property the city had condemned. It listed delinquent stormwater and sewer charges, fees for the board up, and additional charges that totaled $11,456.67. Arlene stared blankly at the bill. It was more than her annual income. Sharina cocked her head and asked, quote, do you see what I have to go through? It might not have been your fault about what happened, but, end quote, she pinched the bill between pointer and thumb and gave it a wiggle. Quote, I got issues, end quote. Sharina reclaimed her seat in room 400. She remembered her first eviction. Nervous and confused, she had gone over the paperwork a dozen times. Everything went her way. Soon after, she filed another eviction, then another. When filling out the court papers, Sharina learned to put quote, ETAL, end quote, after a tenant's name so that the eviction judgment covered everyone in the house, even people she didn't know about. She learned that the correct answer on the documents asking her to estimate damages was, quote, not over $5,000, end quote, the maximum allowed. Learned that commissioners frowned on late fees in excess of $55. Learned that dragging slow-paying tenants to court was usually worth the $89.50 processing fee because it spurred many to find a way to catch up. Plus, she could add the processing fee to their bill. This wasn't Arlene's first eviction either. That had happened 16 years earlier when she was 21. Arlene figured she had rented 20 houses since turning 18, which meant she and her children had moved about once a year, multiple times because they were evicted. But Arlene's eviction record was not as extensive as it should have been. Through the years, she had given landlords different names. Nothing exotic, just subtle alterations. Now, quote, Arlene Bill and, quote, Arlene Bell, end quote, had eviction records. The frazzled court clerks, like many landlords, never stopped to ask for identification. Arlene remembered when they used to take a break from doing evictions around Christmas time in Milwaukee. But they did away with that in 1991 after a landlord convinced the American Civil Liberties Union to argue that the practice was an unfair religious celebration. Some old-timers still observed the moratorium out of kindness or habit of ignorance. Sharina was not one of them. More time passed. The lawyers had gone home. Their cases were called first, leaving only the bailiff and the callers up front. With no one to talk to, the bailiff, a white woman with a compact frame and overbite, began passing the time by sniping at tenants. Quote, silence your cell phone or it will be confiscated, end quote. Both callers had stopped covering their yawns an hour ago. Quote, you have to clear the doorway, end quote, the bailiff announced. Children's shoes tapped the pews. Quote, if you're going to talk, discuss your case outside, end quote. Finally, Arlene looked up to see Sharina step into the hallway and hold the courtroom door open. Quote, we up, end quote, she said. Sharina had waited 2 hours for her case to be called. She had drawn Commissioner Laura Gramlig Perez, a white woman with a military posture but a broad, open face. Gramling Perez, in a dark pantsuit and pearls, asked Arlene to wait in the front while she and Sharina settled another matter. Sharina followed the commissioner back to her office, a stately wood-paneled room lined with law books, framed certificates, and family photographs. The commissioner took her seat at the head of a large hardwood table and asked, quote, any luck with that invoice? End quote. Sharina had been in the office just the day before, asking the commissioner to approve a claim of $5,000 brought against another evicted tenant, the one whose building had been condemned. Each eviction case had two parts. the, quote, first cause of action, end quote, dealt strictly with whether a tenant would be evicted. Next came, quote, the second and third causes of action, end quote, which dealt with what was owed to a landlord, unpaid rent, court fees, and other damages. Most tenants taken to eviction court were sued twice, once for the property and a second time for the debt, and so had two court dates. But even fewer tenants showed up for their second hearing than for their first, which meant landlords' claims about what was owed them usually went unchallenged. Suing a tenant for back rent and court fees was straightforward. Landlords were allowed to charge for unpaid rent, late fees the court found reasonable, and double rent for each day tenants remained in the home after their tenancy had been terminated. Things got murkier when tallying up property damages. Sometimes Sharina guessed an amount on the ride over to eviction court. Quote, how much should I put for the back door? 150? 200? End quote. Sometimes she added on an extermination fee, even though Quentin would take care of it himself. When they did, when the charges didn't give them pause, callers approved landlords' second and third causes with a quick punch of the stamp. When they did, callers pushed the claim up to a commissioner like Grambling Perez, who was now asking Sharina to provide evidence that would justify suing an ex-tenant for the maximum amount allowed in small claims court. Quote, what I'm trying to get from her doesn't even scratch the surface of what she did to the property, end quote, Sharina replied, presenting photos of the trashed unit and the bill she had shown to Arlene. Commissioner Grambling Perez looked everything over, then said, quote, I need something else, end quote. Sharina pushed back but got nowhere. Quote, I'll never get that anyway, end quote, she finally said with a huff. Quote, and that's probably the case, end quote, the commissioner began. Quote, so, end quote. Quote, it's still not fair. Nobody ever does anything to these tenants. It's always the landlord. This system is flawed. But whatever. I'll never see the money. These people are deadbeats, end quote. Grambling Perez brought Sharina's charges from $5,000 down to $1,285. That money judgment joined those of the 8 other eviction cases Sharina initiated earlier in the month, which together totaled over $10,000. Sharina knew that receiving a money judgment and actually receiving the money were different matters. After withholding tenants' security deposits, landlords had limited recourse when it came to collecting. Sharina could try to garnish wages, but this was possible only for former tenants who were employed and living above the poverty line. She could garnish bank accounts, but many of her former tenants did not have bank accounts, and even if they did, state benefits and the first $1,000 were off limits. Okay, let's have a reflection. So, I think one of the things that I want to make sure I articulate is that I don't see Sharina as a bad person, or I don't see people who are landlords as bad people. I don't believe in the concept of somebody just being inherently a bad person, just being born a bad person. I think that most of us are not good or bad people. We're just people, and every day we make decisions and take actions and say things that can be interpreted as being good or bad depending on the situation. And a lot of times our experiences dictate what we believe to be good or bad. And so as somebody who has never been in a position to be a landlord, has never been in a position to own property, when I see how, or when I read and hear about how these tenants are being treated, I see myself more through the eyes of the tenants. And the masses of the world are tenants and not landlords. The majority of people do not own property or do not own homes. The majority of people are renting them, or renting apartments, or renting homes, or living unhoused, or in jail, or in prison. So when I read these things, I view them through those perspectives. And so a lot of the statements and actions that Sharina has made have been exploitative to the experience of the masses of people. And so when she calls these people deadbeats because they don't have enough money to pay back what she's the money, when she calls these people deadbeats because they won't essentially pay back this money that she feels she's owed to them, I wonder, does she view herself as a deadbeat if she can't pay back this $11,000 that the city owes? She's struggling to try to make this $11,000 and to pay this $11,000. And there's other people who's struggling to try to make their $1,100 rent. And not having money or not having enough money to pay for something doesn't make you a deadbeat or doesn't make you a bad person. It means that you're an individual who is experiencing life in a capitalistic society. This capitalism demands that there are some people who are too poor to pay for things, that there are some people who have to live check to check. And so, even the fact that these people, she knows these people don't have bank accounts. She knows that these people don't have unlikely to have over $1,000 in a bank account for her to take. That these people don't have jobs. These are all things that let you know that these people are vulnerable. And so, her you can't try be in the mind state that you're trying to help people and then also be in the mind state that the people that you're trying to help are unworthy or aren't good enough. When you're trying to help somebody, the there is no benefit for yourself. That's the thing that I think sometimes we, uh, especially because of we live in this capitalistic society, we think that trying to help somebody just means giving somebody an opportunity or giving somebody a chance. But those are different things. Helping somebody is not, there's no inherent beneficial uh, benefits in it for you when you're trying to help somebody. If somebody's on the ground and you're going to pick them up off the ground, you don't get anything from them being picked up off the ground. Maybe you enjoy the satisfaction of having helped somebody, but them going from being on the ground to standing up does not have a direct impact on you. You don't get money from it, or you don't become taller from it, or you don't become less likely to fall later on. It's simply about the act of helping this person back up on their feet. And so when she says that she's trying to help these people, it's just not true. She wants rent money from these people. She might be giving these people an opportunity, giving these people a chance, but she wants something in return for that opportunity and for that chance. And then I think the other thing that's important to speak about is the Christmas moratorium. Give me one second. Okay. And so they used to, during Christmas time, have a moratorium on these evictions. And then through legal precedents, that was overturned and they got rid of the Christmas moratorium. And so again, it just lets you know that, because they said it was an unfair religious practice. But again, it just lets you know that in December, inherently, you can understand that there are people who are going to be struggling to try to, whether it's because their kids are off during Christmas for school, so now they need somebody to watch more. They got to pay for people to babysit them or keep track of them. Depending on what kind of job they have, they may need to have to work more hours during Christmas time. They may be working more hours just so they can try to afford presents if they have multiple children, or afford extra food because the children are home more often, or because they need to have more food for Christmas celebration or Christmas dinner. Uh, and so these are all things that would make it so that they would be less likely to be able to pay that rent. And instead of trying to have an understanding of that, instead of trying to make sure that that during this was supposed to be a holiday time, that people are inside their homes and people aren't evicted and out on the streets in the cold in Milwaukee, where it will be cold at in December. Uh, they found a way to override this moratorium and to continue these evictions during December. And so again, it just lets you know that it just points to the exploitation in capitalism and the inhumaneness in capitalism, and the lack of empathy and understanding that is all of these things are important functions for capitalism to continue and to perpetuate in the way that it does in this country. Even so, Sharina and many other landlords filed for second and third causes. This carried consequences for tenants since money judgments were listed on eviction records. An eviction record listing $200 of rental debt left a different impression than one listing $2,000. Money judgments could also suddenly reappear in tenants' lives several years after the eviction, particularly if landlords docketed them. Docketing a judgment slapped it on a tenant's credit report. If the tenant came down to own any property in Milwaukee County in the next decade, the docketed judgment placed a lien on that property, severely limiting a new homeowner's ability to refinance or sell. To landlords, docketing a judgment was a long odds bet on a tenant's future. Who knows? Maybe somewhere down the line, a tenant would want to get her credit in order and would approach her old landlord asking to repay the debt. Quote, debt with interest, end quote. The landlord could respond. since money judgments accrued interest at an annual rate that would be the envy of any financial portfolio. 12%. For the chronically and desperately poor whose credit was already wrecked, a docketed judgment was just another shove deeper into the pit. But for the tenant who went on to land a decent job or marry and then take another tentative step forward, applying for student loans or purchasing a first home, for that tenant, it was a real barrier on the already difficult road to self-reliance and security. Sharina had been thinking about hiring a company like Rent Recovery Service to collect on her second and third causes. The self-described, quote, largest and most aggressive landlord collection agency in the country, end quote, reported delinquent tenants to 3 national credit bureaus and placed them on a nationwide tracking system that allowed the company to follow tenants' financial lives, quote, without their knowledge, end quote. It saw when tenants attempted to get credit, apply for a job, or open a bank account. Like landlords docketing judgments, the company took the long view, waiting for tenants to, quote, get back on their financial feet and begin to earn a living, end quote, before collection could begin. Rent Recovery Service, quote, never closed an unpaid file, end quote. Some of those files contained debt amounts calculated in a reasonable and well-documented way. Others contained bloated second and third causes and unreasonably high interest rates. But since both had the court's approval, Rent Recovery Service did not distinguish between them. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter. And what stands out to me in that passage, I know we just had a reflection, but what stands out to me is this is the manner in which the landlords and these debt collecting services are going after these people, and even the mentality that exists within the landlord's mind or within the debt collector's mind to play the long game, to wait to see if this person tries to accomplish something or waits to buy a house or try to get a house, or they try to essentially get their lives together. And then that's when they want to pounce on them. That's when they want to try to uh, extract whatever money or whatever finances that they can out of these people. And again, when you are operating and have completely bought into this capitalistic society and everything that comes along with it, you may not see that as a bad thing. You may not see that as a wrong thing. But when you are looking at this from a humane standpoint, when you're looking at this from a human interest standpoint, from a societal betterment standpoint, if somebody was once poor, in poverty, living below the poverty line, struggling to keep a job, struggling to keep a home, and as time progresses, for whatever reason, they begin to get things together or get a better job, they have better opportunities, and now they're trying to make advancements. To think to yourself that, well, now we should try to take them for things that they had before. Now we should try to penalize them for mistakes that they made before. Is only is a vulturistic mind state or ideology. It's a mind state that's, and that's what happens when money is put at the highest value all the time, when money is the most important thing all the time. And so to just reading the fact that these people, if they were to go to get a home or were to go to try to get a job or try to go get a credit check, all these different things, that all of this past history would pop back onto their record. It's very eerily similar to the way that the criminal court systems work. And so those are just some of the thoughts that come through my mind. And again, some of these things are things that will stick with me after reading. It's always specific things that stick with me after reading certain pieces of literature, and that help me to form a broader scope of the issues we face. And this book has a lot of those things in them. Okay, let's keep reading. Let's try to finish this chapter for the episode's over. When her turn came, Arlene decided to sit right next to Sharina at the commissioner's table. The two women looked for a moment like old friends or even sisters, with one reflecting life's favor. Sharina was still Sharina was still stewing over being denied her $5,000 claim when the commissioner, without lifting her eyes from Arlene's file, said, quote, your landlady is seeking to evict you for unpaid rent. Are you behind on rent, ma'am? end quote. Quote, yes, end quote, Arlene replied. With that, she lost her case. The commissioner looked at Sharina and asked, quote, are you willing to work something out? End quote. Quote, no, end quote, Sharina answered. Quote, because the thing is, she's too far behind. See, I let her slide when the sister passed away or whatever. She didn't pay all her rent that month. And now it's a whole nother month that has passed, and now she owes a total balance of $870, end quote. Quote, okay, end quote, the commissioner cut in. She turned to Arlene, quote, so your landlady at this point wants you to move out, end quote. Quote, okay, end quote. Quote, do you have minor children at home? End quote. Quote, yep, end quote. Quote, how many? End quote. Quote, two, end quote. Grambling Perez was one of the commissioners who sometimes subscribed to the court custom of giving tenants 2 extra days in the home for each child that was dependent. Quote, I'll be out before the first, end quote, Arlene said. Quote, New Year's at the latest, end quote. Quote, but see, that goes into the beginning of the rental period again, end quote, Sharina interjected. Quote, so you're willing to do a stipulation if she's going before the first? End quote, the commissioner said. Quote, well, end quote, Sharina began, her annoyance no longer even partially concealed. Quote, I have people lined up that want to move in on the first, end quote. But the commissioner had spotted an opening. She knew Arlene would have to leave, but she was trying to spare her the blemish of an eviction record. She tried again. Quote, would you be willing to offer something in return for her agreement to move out by the 31st voluntarily? End quote. Quote, what would I be proposing to offer? End quote, Sharina asked coldly. Quote, to dismiss. End quote. Quote, but what about the other money that she owes me? End quote. A dismissed eviction judgment meant a drop money judgment as well, and obtaining money judgments, even against single mothers on welfare, was one of the primary reasons Sharina evicted tenants through the court system. Quote, well, my point is that you maybe give up a couple of $100 so you don't lose these tenants who are coming in January, end quote. The commissioner knew Sharina could pocket Arlene's security deposit, leaving an unpaid rent balance of $320. Quote, in exchange for an agreement that she won't go after you, end quote. Then Arlene interrupted the commissioner. Quote, I'm not trying to be in her money, end quote, she said. She said it forcefully and looked offended. Arlene had gathered who was making the calls, and it wasn't the white lady with the pearl necklace. Sharina, who had been mulling things over, leaned forward in her chair. I don't want to dismiss anything. I really don't. I mean, I'm tired of losing out on every single, end quote. She began slapping the table with each word. Arlene looked at the commissioner. Quote, I mean, I'm not trying to stay. I mean, I understand what she's saying. That's her place, end quote. Quote, I understand, end quote, said the commissioner. Quote, I'm not trying to be there, end quote. Quote, I understand, end quote. The commissioner shuffled the papers and said nothing more. In the pause, Arlene took another tack. She thought of the broken window, the sporadic hot water, the grimy carpet, and said in a dismissive voice, quote, I would say something, but I'm not even going to go there. I'm all right, end quote. That was her defense. The commissioner looked at Arlene and said, quote, here's the deal, ma'am. You're getting to move out voluntarily by January 1st. If you don't do that, if you don't move out, then your landlord is entitled to come back here without further notice, and she can get a writ of eviction, and then the sheriff will come, end quote. When Sharina and Arlene walked out of the courthouse, a gentle snow was still falling. Sharina had agreed to give Arlene a ride home. In the car, Sharina paused to rub her neck, and Arlene lowered her forehead into the palm of her hand. Both women had splitting headaches. Sharina attributed hers to how court had gone. She was still fuming that Grambling Perez had reduced her money judgment. Arlene's was from hunger. She hadn't eaten all day. And that shows you that one sentence shows you the drastic differences in the experiences that both of these women are having. One of them is having a headache because she has not ate all day, probably because she want to assume things, But whether it's because she couldn't afford to eat or because the circumstances she was dealing with was making it so that she didn't have an appetite, whatever it is, she's now unhoused or has to find a way to move out, find somewhere to go with her 2 kids. She was already living in a shithole of a house. Uh, and so you see what the things that her headache derives from. And Arlene has a headache because she didn't get as much, or excuse me, and Sharina has a headache because she didn't get as much money as she wanted from the courts, because she wanted to try to squeeze these people who are living in poverty, who she knows is living in poverty. She's selling them impoverished homes, and she wants to squeeze them for every drop of blood that they have. But it's okay. She's giving them rides home. Quote, I don't want to be putting you and your babies out in the cold, end quote. Sharina told Arlene as the car moved slowly through the slushy streets. Quote, I wouldn't want nobody to do me like that. Some of them landlords, they get away with murder down there. But there's some like me who get in front of the commissioner and she say whatever's on her mind, and that's the way it's going to go. She know this system is screwed. It's all one-sided, end quote. This woman is insane. All right, let me keep reading. Sorry. I'm usually better with controlling my outbursts, but this is. Arlene stared out the window and watched the snow settle noiselessly on the black iron lamppost, the ornate dome of the public library, the church of the Gesu's Gothic towers. Quote, and some of these tenants, end quote, Sharina was saying, quote, they nasty as hell. They bring roaches with them. They bring mice with them. And who got to pay for it? Or what about Doreen Hingston with her ramen noodles down the sink, and they keep calling me about the sink being stopped up, and I got to call the plumber. Then you pouring grease down the sink from your fried chicken. You pouring the grease down the sink, and I got to get a plumber out again, end quote. The car turned down Center Street, passing a church where Arlene sometimes picked up gift baskets at Thanksgiving and Christmas. She had always aspired to have her own ministry like that, to be the one handing out food and clothing. Quote, so, Arlene, end quote, Sharina pulled in front of Arlene's place on 13th Street. Quote, if you ever think about becoming a landlord, don't. It's a bad deal. Get the short end of the stick every time, end quote. Arlene stepped out of the car and turned back to Sharina. Quote, Merry Christmas, end quote, she said. And then that brings us to the end of chapter 7. That was chapter 7. Excuse me, chapter 8. That brings us to the end of chapter 8, the end of part 1 of the book. Brings us to part 2 of the book, which is entitled Out, and to chapter 9, which is entitled Order Some Carry Out. And I, as we were reading through this book, I think that there were different points in time where it was sort of like you couldn't really get a read on Sharina, the landlord. And I think that when we went through this last chapter, you get a real good read on the type of person. Okay, I don't want to say the type of person, but you get a very good read on the type of landlord Sharina is and the type of ideology that she has as not only a landlord, but as an individual. She's saying, woe is me, essentially, in this car with this woman who she just evicted and complaining about how these things are one sided. And essentially, when she wants somebody evicted, they are evicted. When she wants to put money judgment, she puts money judgment. She's upset because she's not getting as much money as she wants from these people who are poor, who she herself understands is poor. She talks about them bringing roaches and bringing mice and pouring stuff down the sink and her having to call a plumber. These are all things that happen when you are dealing with people who are in poverty, who are impoverished. And to be so ignorant or naive that you don't understand that, and the fact that she doesn't understand how she benefits from these people being impoverished and poor, uh, it's just very mind blowing. And it's again, this is one of the things that why you have to understand the uniqueness of the times that we live in of the 21st century is that it's not simply just a white and a black issue anymore. Once class has entered the equation and capitalism has entered the equation at the extent that it does, you will have black people who exploit other black people. You will have women who exploit other women. You will have people who are low middle class exploiting people who are bottom working class or bottom lower class. So uh, So please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. We will be back tomorrow with another episode of Rockford Reading Daily. We will continue to read Evicted by Matthew Desmond. And remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. Holla at you tomorrow.